Okay, what we see here is an inferior view of the base of the brain showing what's known as the circle of Willis. Okay, so we are looking up at the bottom of a brain. A couple things that might look familiar. One are all the yellow nerves. These are all the cranial nerves that you covered in A&P 1. This is the anterior surface or side. So these would be the first cranial nerves, your olfactory nerves for your sense of smell. These are your optic nerves, which cross, and you'll notice they cross right by the pituitary gland. So this is the pituitary gland. And then these are all the other nerves that head down posteriorly until you reach the spinal cord, which would be located here. So this area here is more of the brain stem. We see a little bit of the cerebellum. So this is posterior cerebellum. This is all cerebrum here. And what we're showing are all these arteries. There's a circular set of arteries known as the circle of Willis, or also known as the cerebral arterial circle. What this circle does, I'm going to mention the two major functions, and then we're going to follow the blood flow. Function number one of these circular arteries is to equalize blood pressure to the brain. So when blood pressure gets very, very high, we don't want that high pressure in the brain. So the circle of Willis helps to relieve some pressure inside the arteries. Function number two is to provide alternate routes for blood flow to the brain should any of these arteries become damaged. So this is an example of collateral circuitry, meaning a specific region of the brain could get blood flow by more than just one path. And you can think of it as if we can get blood into this circle, no matter what, if we have blood in that circle, we can get blood to the brain. So there are more than just one arteries leading to the circle. So if you look kind of closely, here's a circular set of arteries. What I'm going to do is talk about how blood gets to the circle. So what arteries bring blood into the circle? What forms the circle? And then how do we get blood out of the circle? So there's three kind of categories that I put arteries in when we're studying the circle of Willis. The first category is how do we get blood to the circle? That has to do with the two vertebrals, or vertebral arteries, which come up your spinal cord, right? They're coming up each side of the spinal cord in those transverse foramina. Then they merge into one artery called the basilar artery. The basilar artery is found running up the brain stem, and then it supplies blood to the circle right about here. So that's, in essence, two ways to get to the circle. Right or left vertebral artery, and then the basilar artery. The other option are your two internal carotids. So they're traveling up to this circle. So we see them here and here. So these came up the neck, and they're entering right about here and here on that circle. So then there's a set of arteries which connect all of these together. And they are known as the communicating arteries, because to communicate, you make a connection. There's an anterior communicating, and there's posterior communicating. So those will actually form a complete circle of arteries called the circle of Willis. This way, as long as you can get blood in, it should go throughout the circle. So if there's maybe a blockage to the right internal carotid artery, and because of that blockage, you don't want to disrupt blood flow to the entire right side of the brain. So blood can still get into this circle from other routes. So then the question is, how does blood get from the circle to the brain? And that's a fairly easy one. Those are called cerebral arteries. And if they're going towards the anterior portion of the brain, they're anterior cerebrals. If they're the ones going kind of to the middle part of the brain, they're called middle cerebrals. And those are actually the larger of the cerebral arteries. And then if they're going towards the back of the brain, they're called the posterior cerebral arteries. So at first glance, this can be a very kind of confusing picture and hard to understand. But I think if you keep it simple and just group your arteries into how do you get to the circle, what forms the circle, and then how do you get out of the circle to the brain, that makes it a little more manageable. Next thing I like to do is continue with that subclavian artery and see what happens to it. So obviously this is a picture of an arm, and we can go right back to the beginning, which would be the aorta. So here's that ascending aorta. Here's the brachiocephalic trunk. We just learned what happened if we were to go up this common carotid. We just saw what would happen to this little vertebral. Now we're going to see what happens if we went into the subclavian. So there's that subclavian directly underneath the clavicle or collarbone. There it is going into the armpit, and now it's named the axillary. Then into the arm, and it's known as the brachial artery. And then it divides into the radial artery, which is obviously running along the radius. So we have to remember that our radius is on the lateral side of the forearm, or thumb side. The ulnar, which is on the medial side of the forearm, or pinky side. And then those two arteries actually form some arches that are in the palm. And then off of those arches, there's all kinds of arteries called metacarpal arteries and digital arteries, but we're not going to go that far into the hand. But you should know how to get to the wrist. If your blood coming out of the heart and entering the aorta, what are the arteries you travel through in order to get to the wrist? Maybe the lateral side of the wrist versus the medial side of the wrist. Same is true as if your blood in the aorta, how do you get to the brain? How do you travel from aorta by learning different blood vessels as you get to the brain? So if you learn your arteries by blood flow, I think you're reinforcing those blood vessels. Okay, next region is the thoracic aorta, and that's this region of the descending aorta that runs down through the thoracic cavity and then eventually goes through the diaphragm. And these arteries are pretty straightforward in that they're divided into arteries that go to internal organs, so those would be the visceral branches, pericardium, lungs get oxygenated blood by bronchial arteries, because if you recall, the pulmonary arteries are deoxygenated. The esophagus is going to be in the thoracic cavity, and then other structures in the mediastinum get blood flow using mediastinal arteries. So those just go to organs that are in the thoracic cavity. But then the thoracic cavity is made up of the walls. So parietal branches, parietal means wall. So these are the branches that actually deliver blood to parts of the chest. The posterior intercostals, those will go to intercostal muscles, ribs, thoracic vertebrae. Some branches will go into the spinal cord, but also skin of the chest. Subcostals will also go to some muscles, ribs, some of the vertebrae and skin in that region. And then finally, the phrenic arteries, the superior phrenic, goes to the upper surface of the diaphragm. So notice that the diaphragm is shown on this drawing as this flat dome-shaped muscle. Well, it has to get blood flow. So there are superior phrenics coming off this thoracic aorta that fall down onto the top of the diaphragm. We're going to see off the abdominal aorta, there's actually inferior phrenic arteries. So now that diaphragm gets blood flow both to the top surface and the bottom surface. So the next video, we're gonna move into the abdomen. We're gonna follow that aorta, see it penetrate through the diaphragm. There's a hole there known as the hiatus. And then we're going to learn all these different arteries that come off of your abdominal aorta.